titled Decolonising Psychology and the Transformative Role of the Australian Indigenous Psychology Education Project. Before I introduce our speakers and seminar for today, I'd like to talk a bit about the Community Identity Displacement Research Network, who organises these seminars. Dudgeon is a multidisciplinary research space at Victoria University that fosters scholarly investigations of new diasporas and meanings of displacement and identity. It's a space where new questions about indigeneity, racism, transnationalism, sense of place, and social justice can be raised and discussed. Dudgeon runs these research seminars along scholarly work, conferences, and other events. So with that in mind, please keep an eye out for other seminars that we'll be hosting, as well as other events that we have on. Also, if anyone is interested in presenting at one of these seminars themselves, please get in contact with us or check out our website at www.communityidentity.com.au. Our presenters for today's seminar are Pat Dudgeon, Belle Selkirk, and Joanna Alexi. Professor Pat Dudgeon is a Bardi woman from the Kimberley, Western Australia. Pat is recognised as being among the world-leading experts on social and emotional well-being and suicide prevention. She is a research fellow in the School of Indigenous Studies, chief investigator of the Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing Project, and the director of the National Centre of Best Practice in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander suicide prevention at the Poach Centre for Indigenous Health at the University of Western Australia. She specialises in Indigenous psychology, mental health, and education. Belle is a Noongar woman from the southwest of Western Australia. She is connected to her culture through her grandmother, Lila Hume, who has been a strong role model in her life. She grew up on Wadandi Buja as a child, then relocated to Wajak Buja as a young adult to study psychology. Belle completed her Master of Psychology clinical at the end of 2008, and her thesis examined the outcomes of a school-based resilience program for Indigenous primary school students. She was also the inaugural recipient of the APS Bendi Lunga Bursary. Belle now has over 12 years of experience working in the mental health field in a variety of roles, including clinical psychologist, group therapist, mentor, and researcher. Belle juggles her time between her family, being a mother, working in a private psychology practice, and as a research fellow with the Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing Project. Dr. Joanna Alexi is a postdoctoral research associate at the Poach Centre for Indigenous Health, School of Indigenous Studies at the University of Western Australia. She works in Professor Pat Dudgeon's team on the Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing Project. This project promotes and develops the social and emotional wellbeing paradigm and the importance of Indigenous knowledges. Joanna is passionate about promoting wellbeing outcomes with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples with the focus on strength-based approaches. This presentation today will examine the definitions and applications of critical race theory and decolonisation in the context of the discipline of psychology. Decolonising psychology in the Australian context will be discussed with reference to the Australian Indigenous Psychology Education Project. AIPEP is an innovative Aboriginal-led project pioneering the way in transforming and decolonising higher education in psychology. It aims to increase the cultural responsiveness and capacity of the emerging and current mental health workforce to work effectively with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. This groundbreaking project also aims to increase student support of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander psychology students, as well as consider and explore the role that each of us play in decolonising psychology and transforming education for the next generation of the workforce. Just before I hand it over to our presenters, I'd like to inform you all that during the presentation, you'll be able to use the Q&A function to post any questions for the presenters that you may have, and you'll also be able to thumbs up questions which you'd particularly like to be answered. After the presentation, we'll have a dedicated portion of time for a moderated Q&A session where these questions will be answered and discussed for the panelists. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Pat, Belle, and Joanna.
Great, and I'll just share my screen, Pat, on my end.
Yes.
All right, can everyone see that all right?
Yes, but you might have to go slideshow.
Yeah. Perfect, there you go.
Beautiful. Okay, Oh, thank goodness we're here. Look, everyone, sorry about the bit of a slow start, but we had big technology problems. I was saying I think Joanne was the only one who got in smoothly. So we were saying, Joanna, you're going to have to do the whole session yourself. But we sorted that out in the end. Anyway, I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I was looking at the chat before we opened up the PowerPoint, and it's wonderful. Everyone's coming in saying hello and which countries they're coming in from. So welcome everyone. I hope that our session will excite and invigorate you. As the PowerPoint says, we're talking about a specific project we're doing, which is part of decolonising psychology, and we think that it's going to have a big role to play in transforming psychology. We're all psychologists ourselves as well. But before we start, we'd like to acknowledge and pay our respects to all our elders, past, present and emerging. We'd like to also acknowledge and respect the continuing culture, strength and resilience of all Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities. Also, we'd like to acknowledge and pay respects to all our non-Indigenous allies who stand by our side as we undertake the struggle for social justice. So thank you, everyone. We're all in this together. Oh, I sound like a political advertisement, but anyway, just a little bit about us. We live and work in beautiful Noongar Budja, Noongar country. That is the Horton's map of Indigenous language groups. Most of you will have seen it. So we're in Perth and Western Australia, except for Belle, who's in the southern areas. So she's not in Perth. Where are you, Belle?
Wadandi Budja. So it's about 3 hours drive south of Perth. So still Noongar Nation, but a different language group in Noongar Nation.
So we all happily work and live in this beautiful Noongar Nation, and we send our best wishes to everyone else who's calling in from all the different countries that make up our beautiful, diverse Indigenous Australia. Also from overseas, I saw someone ring in from Arizona. So welcome, welcome. Next slide. Basically, what we're going to do today is that we're going to talk a little bit about Indigenous psychology. We're going to talk about our program, the Australian Indigenous Psychology Education Program, or AIPEP, what's happening there and the outcomes. We'll talk a little bit about the current psychology workforce, or Indigenous workforce, our Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing grant, which is a NHMRC Million Minds mission grant, and our project is actually a part of that. So that's this is the second iteration of AIPEP. So we'll place it in context of that bigger grant too, which is doing a lot of wonderful transformative things as well. Then we'll talk about the development and engagement of AIPEP 2, particularly our community of practice, how we hope that we're a part of decolonising psychology in education, but also in practice. And then we'll have time for questions and reflections. But basically, before we start off, I'd just like to put a bit of context around our conversation or our discussion that we're having today. And most of you will know this, but I'll just go over it in any case. As we know, Aboriginal presence, or Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander presence in Australia is very long. We've been here between 60 to 75,000 years, and it's so we have this very rich culture and history. We're recognised as the oldest living culture in the world. Colonisation only occurred just a bit over 200 years ago, when the British invaded the East Coast in 1770, and for us in Western Australia, it was in 1829. So the process of colonisation is relatively recent in that enormous long history that we have. But despite the colonisation that has impacted on Indigenous people, not just us, but across the world, we have survived, and there has been strength and resilience. So next slide. We know, however, some of the impacts of colonisation was to deny that the land belonged to us. So there was a proclamation of terra nullius. So that was put into the law that the land belonged to no one. Invasion followed, leading to frontier wars and genocide, the forced removal of Aboriginal people from their countries, the dispossession from the land. After that, assimilation policies, including the stolen generations, were enacted on all Aboriginal people. And that's relatively recent too. I have access to my grandmother's native welfare records, and you can see the histories there. It's in my living memory of my grandmother and her generation being put under assimilation policies, having to ask to, for simple human rights. So it's not that far away from our present day. We're still not recognised. A treaty is required. But we know that that impact of colonisation, that we as a nation needs to, we're in a process of recovery and healing and reclaiming our culture. However, there's one of the good things about Indigenous Australia is that there's always surveys about our well-being, health and well-being. So we know that there's a massive gap between the health and well-being of Indigenous people versus non-Indigenous people, hence closing the gap campaigns and close the gap government processes. So I think the right policies are now being put into place that can address those disparities. But we know, for instance, that the suicide rates are twice as high for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people than other Australians. If you break that down into age groups or region, you get even a more bleak picture. So that's one of our big issues. We know that there's been measurements of psychological distress, and Aboriginal people experience much higher rates of psychological distress than other people. We know that Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander youth, almost 2 in 3 experience significant stresses or adverse life events. And for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander youth, 1 in 3 report being treated differently because of their race. So these are the realities and ongoing challenges to Indigenous wellbeing. So that's the context we're working in. And I guess why we do mention those rather negative statistics, but they are a reality for our people, is that we do need change. And so anything we do, particularly in psychology, is really important. Psychology until recently has not included Indigenous people or any people from culturally different backgrounds. So we love the American Psychological Association. We're part of that task, part of the group under the task force, but they have a great definition of what an Indigenous psychology, and that means a decolonising psychology, looks like. And they say, which we subscribe to, that an Indigenous psychology is an intellectual movement across the globe based on the following factors: that it has to be a reaction against colonisation and the hegemony of Western psychology. That secondly, there's a need for non-Western cultures to solve their local problems through an Indigenous practice and applications. Thirdly, there is a need for non-Western culture to recognise itself in the constructs and practices of psychology. And fourth, the need to use Indigenous philosophies and concepts to generate theories of global discourse. So that really resonated with us, because it draws from Indigenous ways of doing, being, knowing, being and doing. It also considers the role of colonisation and how that has contemporary impacts. It's informed by self-determination and engages in culturally responsible, responsive, safe principles and practice. And it involves decolonising research methodologies, including methodologies that we've used, such as Aboriginal participatory action research. For us, particularly, we feel that, you know, the models that we're, or paradigms that we're now developing, such as social emotional wellbeing, are more suited for Indigenous people and probably non-Indigenous people as well. Whatever we do in Indigenous areas, whether it's in psychology, justice, or whatever, I think that it's important to hark back to the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous, the rights of Indigenous people. So 2 articles in particular are important to the work we do in Indigenous psychology, and that's our right to self-determination and the right to have autonomy and self-government in matters relating to our internal and local affairs. So the research work we do in developing Indigenous frameworks or models is with local communities, and those principles inform all the work that we do. A little bit about social emotional wellbeing as a paradigm in Indigenous psychology, and part of the decolonising element is we've been working and doing a lot of work in the Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing grant, working with Aboriginal communities, both local, state and nationally, looking at a different, I don't know, conceptualisation of selfhood. And we find that a social emotional wellbeing approach is much more suited for Aboriginal people, because previous theories of psychology haven't suited us well. So if you look at an Aboriginal conception of selfhood, if you have the self in the middle, that's, you know, the individual, but we're made up of our connection to our body and behaviours and our connection to our mind and emotions. So then it departs from a Western model, but because we're also, what's important for us is our connection to our family and kinship. So very important, our connection to our community, our connection to our culture, our connection to our country and land, and our connection to our spirit, spirituality and ancestors. But they're not static things. In the background of that is a history of colonisation. It is the social determinants that still impact on Indigenous people. It's still, and the political determinants that shape our lives. Now, this is, while we're focused on this for as a model for Indigenous people, it also applies to non-Indigenous people. But all fundamental in there is the concepts of holistic health, that health doesn't just mean the physical well-being of an individual, but it is the social, emotional and cultural well-being of the whole community. And healthcare services need to strive to achieve a whole of life state where individuals are able to achieve their full potential as human beings, and must bring about the total well-being of their communities. So you can't take an individual out, do some kind of intervention on them without considering their families and their communities. So that's what we're working towards. There actually is a big policy document, the National Strategic Framework for Aboriginal People's Mental Health and Social Emotional Wellbeing. So we'll be looking at advocating for that to be implemented. There also is 9 guiding principles, which I'm not going to go through. I'll leave those. These slides will be made available, and we've also got a big list of resources, papers that were done in working with communities to look at social emotional wellbeing and so on. So you'll have a great bunch of resources that you'll be able to read in your own time. But if I go on a bit, one, just to signal too that part of our work, which in Indigenous psychology and decolonising psychology, is the way we go about doing research. There is room for quantitative research, but we use qualitative research. So I wouldn't go throwing out the baby with the bathwater, and it'd be interesting for people to read the Guy Dewey statement, because that talks about the best of both worlds, but for Indigenous people, both in mainstream and ensuring that cultural knowledges are valued and exercised as well. But for us, a lot of our work, we've used an Aboriginal participatory action research methodology. That's a strength-based Indigenous research methodology. We've actually got this rather deadly paper, if I don't say so myself, that you can all race out after here and download from our website or from Loicha. We work, our APAR works in genuine partnerships with Aboriginal community organisations to co-design research and ensures Indigenous governance. So it's quite a deep process. Community feedback privileges local voice. We generate locally led solutions and ensure that our research continues to align with community needs. So we found that APAR promotes empowerment, self-determination, social emotional well-being and decolonisation. And it draws upon an Indigenous knowledge system, and local and community-based knowledges are essential for community well-being and need to be valued and has presence. My swirly hand is like, next slide. So the key elements of an APAR approach and other approaches as well is that there needs to be self-determination. There needs to be Aboriginal leadership and Indigenous governance. We need to include the community as co-researchers. We need to co-design with community and local, with the community, and ensure that there's localised knowledge generation. There needs to be community level feedback and dissemination. And basically, if you know the NHMRC core values in working with Indigenous people, if you put those into action, you capture all the main principles of doing empowering research. We also use the SEWB framework and the 9 guiding principles there. So at this point, I've given you a bit of probably some of the work that we've been focused in. I'm going to hand over to Belle now, who's going to take us through a bit of a timeline and then talk on other things and a bit more of the timeline. So over to you, Belle.
I'm going to, before you sign off, I'm going to get you actually to speak to this part of the timeline. I'm going to pick up the last part of the timeline. And this is important. And thanks so much for all the context, because I really want to acknowledge you as such a pioneer in this space. And I can see, you know, comments are popping up there as well. But love to hear you kind of talk to these first few bits of our timeline, because you were a large part of this process.
Okay, happy to do so. I think for us, you know, when we started talking about change and how mainstream models did not suit us, and the social emotional wellbeing framework actually had its beginnings in 1989. So that beautiful diagram we saw, that was done by the Indigenous Psychologists Association, myself and other Indigenous psychs, but we knew that came from this huge history. We didn't pop it out of our own heads. It actually comes from a significant history where Aboriginal health leaders in health and wellbeing met and discussed issues back in 1989 and said that there needed to be a change. We needed to have holistic health, mental health, and so on. After that, Pat Swan and Beverly Raphael did the Ways Forward report. Now, that's a Bible in the area, and I actually was a part of that, so that's telling me age as well. So I was part of the national consultations and the first ever Indigenous mental health, if you like, conference that was held in Sydney. So that formed the Ways Forward report, which is our Bible, and which the social emotional wellbeing framework is extracted from, and all our social emotional wellbeing work from then on has its roots in the Ways Forward report. basically for Australia. So what we do as individuals in our work, our universities, our studies is not disconnected from what's happening out there in terms of politics and society. So for the big significant dates for us is that in 2001, there was a push for reconciliation. So to bring us together as Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and that was significant. Some people say, oh, you know, it was a bit tame and didn't really, you know, address the issues, but it started a process where a lot of organisations and people started thinking of reconciliation action plans and so on. So that was the beginning of a change as well. In 2007, the first national strategic framework for mental health and social emotional wellbeing was developed. It was brilliant, but it was never implemented. Regardless, the movement had started. So I think a lot of, particularly the Aboriginal community control sector, social emotional wellbeing is a big issue. So even though formally it was never implemented, I think it signalled the start of a different approach to Indigenous mental health and wellbeing. In 2007, the United Nations Declaration was made. In 2007 as well, Close the Gap started. So, you know, there was the good measurements that were in place looked at the differences between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, hence, and saw the gap in health mainly, but later we see that gap in mental health and wellbeing. AIPEP, the Australian Indigenous Psychologists Association, was founded in 2008. And in 2008, too importantly, the Australian Psychological Society, oh no, we're late, I beg your pardon, I jump ahead of myself. I was thinking that was a bit too early. There was a national apology given to those members of the stolen generations by the government of Australia. That was a significant moment. I can still remember that. I think you know, for that dark period of history to be acknowledged and an apology given was an important milestone. And it was just an important milestone. I still remember that. Later on, what is it? Belle will talk about the APS apology too, because I think that's part of righting the wrongs of what's happened in history. But so I'll pause there, the national apology, and pass it over to Belle and Joanna.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks. Forgive me for looping you back in, but it was really important that I think that you spoke to that history, and all of this context is actually really, really important to understanding the discipline of psychology in Australia. And you can really get that sense from looking at that timeline and hearing from you, Pat, and all this, you know, foundational work that you've done, that this is a really important part of social justice. So Joe and I will be speaking more about about AIPEP, and that will give context. So all the context that Pat has provided gives context to why this project has come about and why it continues to be a really, really important project in psychology in Australia. So AIPEP stands for the Australian Indigenous Psychology Education Project. Back in 2013, led by Pat and team, was the first iteration of that project. And that was really in the recognition that there is little to no Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledges in higher education. And a lot of the content of what was being taught in university psychology courses was very much from that colonial Eurocentric deficit standpoint. And very, very little acknowledgement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander worldviews and knowledge systems and conceptualizations of health and well-being, such as, you know, social and emotional well-being, which we saw in earlier slides. This has huge flow-on effects. It means that Aboriginal voices are not promoted and privileged in the discipline of psychology. It has flow-on effects to how people in psychology workforce are interfacing with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It impacts on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students' experiences coming into university wanting to study psychology. So not having that cultural frame of reference when they're engaging in the material. Not being able to translate what they're learning at the university level to their own communities. Has flow-on effects to non-Indigenous students. They're not learning these other worldviews or conceptualizations of health and well-being. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, they're entering then into the workforce really lacking those skills and expertise on how to work culturally appropriately in a psychology space. So this was a very important, I'll get you to just kind of go back. So this was a very important part of the first iteration of AIPEP. So it is to really address that underrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices and peoples in the field and discipline of psychology, and in particular, really targeting cultural responsiveness in psychology curriculum. Thanks, Jo. So from the first iteration of AIPEP, 3 key documents were produced. These were published in 2016. They are still extremely relevant today, and there is really broad policy implications. I'll talk about the three frameworks. You can access these and download them from the AIPEP website, and I know Chris has put that link in the chat, but it's also at the end of the slides. Please do have a look at these frameworks, whether you're in an education space or work in the workforce. There's really good information there that you can integrate into your practice. So the first of the documents was the AIPEP curriculum framework, and that was directly looking at Indigenous knowledges and how that's embedded in psychology curriculums at both the undergraduate and postgraduate levels. The second key document was the guidelines for increasing the recruitment, retention and graduation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. So looking at the number of students kind of coming into psychology courses, their experiences during their education, and also progressing to the levels. So from that undergraduate to honours to postgraduate and beyond. So really getting that successful experience through their education career. The final document is the AIPEP Workforce Capability Framework, and that was really looking at the workforce. So what core capabilities do people, whether it's graduates of psychology or registered psychologists, need to be able to work effectively with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and community? Now, one really important kind of what I want to land on here is, and I said that these documents had really broad implications for policy application. So in 2019, the Australian Psychology Accreditation Council, working from these frameworks, embedded a new standard around cultural responsiveness. So what this meant is all higher education providers that had a accredited psychology program had to demonstrate how they were working towards cultural responsiveness in their curriculum, but also just in their within their school and interfacing with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. This is really important. So this was a huge shift in the timeline. So that meant that it went from it being discretionary on each higher education provider in terms of what they're doing to actually it now being a necessary. Okay. We'll go to the next slide. Thanks, Jo. So why is it necessary? So this is really important. So we have estimates that there are about 40,000 psychologists in Australia. Now, Jo, can I clarify, is this registered psychologists? 40,000 registered psychologists in Australia, I believe. Yeah.
I think so, yeah.
Because I think that stats came from APRA. So we've got about 40,000 registered psychologists in Australia. And of that, less than 1% of those registered psychologists are identified as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So when we look at the proportionate stats of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the population, which is about 3.3%, that's a huge disparity. So we're needing to look at really engaging successfully over more than 1,000 more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander psychologists in the community to reach that parity. Something like the AIPEP accreditation standard is really going to support reaching these desirable targets. So with this in mind, the AIPEP 2, so the second iteration of AIPEP was on the agenda. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So let's go to the next slide. So let's come back to the timeline and pick up from, I guess, from that first iteration of AIPEP. So since the first iteration, there's been further really important movements that's been happening throughout Australia, but also in the psychology space. So worth noting, so we had Gaia Dewey Proud Spirit Australia Declaration in 2015, and that was and they're doing really phenomenal work around bringing cultural inclusiveness into mainstream mental health services. 2016, as Pat mentioned, was the APS apology to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Very, very important. And that, for me, that really represented a deep acknowledgement of the role psychology has had in the marginalisation of Aboriginal voices and Aboriginal people and communities, and that psychology as a discipline has to account for that and acknowledge that, and plays a role in reconciliation and moving forward. And as Pat will say, the APS was the first discipline to come out strong and do that, and really was a leader in doing that apology. We also have in 2017 the renewal of the National Strategic Framework for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mental health and social and emotional wellbeing. That National Strategic Framework hasn't been implemented as such, but the framework itself is and I also encourage you to go back and have a look at it yourself. So that's this blue one here, because it really is a useful document in articulating SEWB conceptualizations and how to implement that into policy and practice. 2019 was when the new AIPEP accreditation standard came in. That was a very important moment. And then adding on top of that, in 2020, when the APS came out and did their Black Lives Matters statement around anti-racism. So again, it's our psychology bodies really stepping it up in doing recognition and action towards decolonising policies and practices in the psychology space. 2020, we had the national agreement around closing the gap targets and really systematically addressing very important targets. And then in 2020 is the second iteration of AIPEP 2. And that's what we're really going to be focusing on. But before we go on to the next slide, I guess the context of what I want to kind of illustrate here is you can see all the way back from what Pat was saying, is that there's been this progressive social change that's been happening over a long, long time. And we can see in this last half of the timeline here that there's movement happening in the psychology space that's actually really, really important. And no longer are we wanting to accept, I guess, systems that are leading to ongoing oppression and discrimination. So this context is important as to why AIPEP 2 is a very important project right now. So it's pretty exciting times. Let's go to the next one. So the AIPEP 2 was revitalised under the Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing grant, which both Pat, Jo and I work under Pat's leadership, and we'll talk more about this project. Really encourage you to have a look at the website, and that's also going to be included in our resource list at the end. So this is a really groundbreaking, innovative research grant that has very strong Aboriginal leadership and governance, and really looking at transforming how mental health care is taking place within Australia, and really coming back to cultural conceptualizations of health and wellbeing and mental wellbeing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. There's 3 core streams. So we have empowering access, empowering workforce, empowering service systems, and we also have the hub. The AIPEP project falls in the empowering workforce stream, and that's what we'll be talking about a bit more. Here is our Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing team. We have, I always say, our 3 very deadly, very strong matriarchs. We have Professor Pat Dudgeon, Professor Helen Milroy, and Professor Jill Milroy. We have a very diverse and experienced research team of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researchers and scholars, as well as non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander allies. So it's a very strong team. We have some really amazing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander partners that are very important in this process. For example, National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation, Gaia Dewey, the Australian Indigenous Psychological Association, Healing Foundation, just to name a few. So these are our partners that we work with collaboratively, and also forms part of our Indigenous governance, which is just so important in this process. All right, so now we're actually going to get into the nitty-gritty of the second iteration of AIPEP2. I'm going to let Jo do a bit of the talking to this, and you'll hear from me a little bit later on.
Great, thank you so much, Belle. Yeah, that was a great segue into discussing the second iteration of AIPEP. So as Belle mentioned, AIPEP falls within the Empowering the Workforce stream of the Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing project. And so really, AIPEP2 is working in partnership with higher education providers to implement the findings from that first iteration of AIPEP through a number of different initiatives, including a big one, which is building a national community of practice with higher education providers to build capacity and to support curriculum transformations towards cultural responsiveness and towards helping educators to better support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander psychology students as well. And so we've seen the numbers really double and really take off in this community of practice. We've got more than 70% of universities nationwide that have signed up to the community of practice. I think that's about 30 universities that are on board. And so that's been just a tremendous outcome. And in the last year, we've had numbers double. So it is constantly growing and has been really great. And I will speak to the community of practice just in a moment as well. Another initiative and project that is happening within AIPEP is a scoping and evaluation of psychology education. And this, we're hoping to distribute the survey in the next month or so. And this will really look to evaluate and understand how higher education providers have gone in actually making those curriculum transformations that we're talking about, that were embedded within the APEC standards. So how are providers decolonising their curriculum? How are they embedding cultural responsiveness within their curriculum? How are they supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students? And what's unique from what they're doing to what the Indigenous Education Centre at their school is already providing? So this is really important to understand and really to get a sense of what are the sorts of enablers that have helped them to make this change, as well as what are the barriers and what are they sort of facing against that they need some additional guidance and support with. So that scoping and evaluation will be a really important part of the AIPEP project. Importantly as well, we're working with key stakeholders and peak psychology bodies within the AIPEP2 Executive Stakeholder Advisory Group. So we're working with AIPA, the Australian Indigenous Psychologists Association, APAC, the Australian Psychological Society, APS, the Psychology Board of Australia, or SIBA, and the heads of departments and schools of psychological association or HODSPA. And so this is really good for that cross communication and cross collaboration, and to ensure that the initiatives that are happening within those organisations are captured within what we're sort of doing, and that they are also understanding the initiatives that are happening within AIPEP. So there's that alignment between all of that work that's being done. And so just a little bit more about the community of practice. So the community of practice within AIPEP consists of representatives from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander psychology bodies, including AIPA. So this helps to ensure that Indigenous governance throughout the project, as well as about 30 higher education providers. I think we might have a couple more that have just recently signed up. And so representatives from these schools are people like heads of schools of psychology, undergraduate and postgraduate coordinators, senior lecturers, course conveners that all come to these meetings. And there's a lot of strong engagement and collaboration in those meetings. We also, as I mentioned before, have representation from APS and HODSPA. And then within the executive group, we have additional representation from SciBA and APAC as well. And so these community of practice meetings are held once every second month now via Zoom, and they're facilitated by Professor Pat Dudgeon. And so really the community of practice is about building capacity of educators through that ongoing sharing and topic discussions. And we have a range of topic discussions and they change sort of every month or so. But really we've spoken a lot about the meaning of decolonising psychology and what it means and how it looks like on the ground, as well as supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in terms of recruitment, retention and graduation, and then speaking about the curriculum development and examples of best practice. And we've had educators come in and speak a little bit about what they're doing in their curriculum, how they've gone about making changes, and sort of, I guess, yeah, talking a little bit about those enablers and barriers as well. And that's been really helpful for others just to hear about and get some examples of what they can do and what's feasible within their means as well. Another part of AIPEP is really upskilling the psychology professionals and students through a number of different initiatives, including online APS webinars, and we did a few last year and hoping to do some more this year. Also sharing online resources. So the AIPEP website has been revitalised and we put a lot of resources on there. We've got all of the original AIPEP resources from the first iteration, and also lots more that we've since uploaded. And so that's a really good space to just get an understanding of decolonising psychology, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander topic matters, and professional development as well. So that's really good space. And we've got the link for that at the end, so you can navigate to that website. We do have a mailing list that's part of the community of practice, but we also, if you would like to sign up to the mailing list, would also distribute information relevant to you through that mailing list as well. So another part is also providing some one-on-one support with higher education providers, and I'll talk a little bit to that in just a moment. Okay, so I guess here in this kind of little section going forward is we just wanted to actually give you some information about some practice principles that if you're an educator or you're working with students can start to think about in terms of your cultural responsiveness journey, and some practical sort of tips going forward. So I guess at this point, I just want to emphasize that it really is all of our responsibility to work in culturally safe ways. And if we want a culturally safe mental health workforce that can work really effectively with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, as well as diverse communities, then we really need to train and to build the capacity of students and to upskill the current workforce that might not have had that education prior that students are now getting. So just some, I guess, pointers and some things to think about and consider, and principles are first really looking at building relationships. And this is building relationships with Indigenous education centres at the school, Indigenous academics and scholars within the university, but also outside of the university. So building those international connections. And also building partnerships with local community organisations. So thinking about that as well. Another important principle is engaging collaboratively with elders and cultural advisors around a culturally responsive long-term plan for the school. So thinking about the initiatives and thinking about that long-term plan and what that looks like is going to be really important. And so within this, things to consider is the establishment of an Indigenous advisory committee that can provide guidance and oversee that process and that long-term plan. Also thinking about the cultural safety within the school and within the university and how that can be promoted within this long-term plan. We know that staff are more likely to stay if they actually feel culturally safe within their work environment. So that's a really important point to make as well. Also thinking about staff. So hiring Indigenous staff and what their career progression will look like. And really important is the curriculum change plan. So if you are making changes, it's really important to have that cross collaboration between educators and unit coordinators, so that content isn't necessarily getting repeated every single year, but it's actually got that stepped progression. So when we talk about that, we're talking about the horizontal and vertical integration of content. We're wanting to make sure that as students progress, they're getting different content that's building on the previous content that they're learning, and that's across all of the years. So from undergraduate to postgraduate levels. Another consideration is just to think about approvals. What does that approval process look like? Have you linked in with the Indigenous Education Centre to get some approvals, and I guess get the approvals within the school as well? So making sure, again, that content isn't necessarily being repeated every single time, but that it's actually building on the previous content that's learned. Okay, so another really important part, and I guess this is at both levels, is just to consider that there will be the individual educators process, so your own individual process of cultural responsiveness and going through that journey and what that looks like. So building the awareness, building the knowledge, having that self-reflexivity and that thinking space to really think about what kind of changes are needed within your course. And then there's that school level process as well that needs to be considered. So, and it's similar to what I was talking about before, which is around just making sure that there's that coherent learning across undergraduate and postgraduate levels. Finally, really important to engage in student lived experience and to support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander psychology students through a number of different entry pathways and progressions of their course. So here it would be really important to consider what resources are available to students and where are they getting these resources from? Do they know about the AIPEP website? Are there resources on the school's website? So thinking about those sort of resources for where they can go to get support and making sure that students are linked into the Indigenous Education Centre where possible, as well as thinking about the development of pathway programs and criteria. So again, making sure these are linked into the Indigenous Education Centre so they know about and can disseminate that information, but also making sure that those pathway programs are really widely disseminated on school websites and through students that way as well. And really thinking about those entry pathways and how they actually support that progression from undergraduate levels to postgraduate levels. And Belle spoke to this before, which was really important. As well, thinking about scholarships. Again, where those are disseminated, what kind of scholarships are available to students? Are they coming from outside organisations as well that you can let students know about? And finally, a student reference group for input and feedback. So this is really important to just draw on lived experience from students about how they're finding their student experience within psychology. Are there things that can be changed? Are there initiatives that they would really like to see and that they can help to co-design? So that's a really important one to consider also. So we thought we would just give a couple of examples. There's some really great examples in the Insight Decolonising Psychology article that was released in 2020, and that has a few national examples, but I'll just speak to a couple of examples within our own backyard, the UWA School of Psychological Sciences. That have been involved within AIPEP and have made some really good and important system changes. So just a few examples there. We've been working really closely with the UWA School of Psychological Sciences, and that has happened through representation within the AIPEP 2 community of practice. So we have a few representatives from SBS come to those meetings and to share what they're doing, but also to engage in those discussions and learn from others, which has been really good. We've also been assisting with some curriculum transformations that are happening within the school and just providing some feedback around content and any sort of questions that might come up. Also, we've established a SBS yarning circle and yarning group, and this is in collaboration with AIPEP 2 as well. And so with these kind of yarning groups, what's really important is just to have that time ask questions that pop up, but also that reflective time to just think about any new knowledges that people are learning, and just to have that sort of regular discussion and communication is really important. Even things like practicing acknowledgements of country and cultural introductions have been really useful, we've found. And also just some early engagement as well on a long-term plan for the school, which is important to think about. And some system changes that are happening within the school that have been excellent is the establishment of an Indigenous honours student pathway with a cut-off entry guarantee into honours, which is great. Also, acknowledgements of country are encouraged in student and lecturer presentations. And for student presentations, this isn't included in the time limit that they have. So this really encourages students to just practice doing an acknowledgement of country where they can. Also, they've established a student reference group, and this is really been quite vital in providing feedback on student experience. So things like how they've found different content that's been delivered, what can be improved, what's been really good, and just linking students into the initiatives that are happening at the school level. Finally, there's also been the UWA School of Psychological Sciences and School of Indigenous Studies that have partnered on a mentoring program. And so this program links undergraduate Indigenous psychology students to postgraduate students with the aim of really enhancing student experience and cultural safety, and also just to provide students that are going through that undergraduate level to just understand a little bit more about some of the career progressions, any questions that come up for them, things around curriculum and courses have been really important. And so that has been a really great mentorship program for undergraduate students. There are some national examples, but I won't go into them. Please do have a look at the Insight article for some more national examples from universities, but people are doing some really great things, and it's great to just get an understanding of what people are doing to give you some examples and to see what's sort of feasible within your school as well. So yeah, please have a look at that. The resource is at the end of the presentation, and I'll just pass you now to Belle, who will talk a little bit more about some practice examples and principles.
Sure. Also want to add that the AIPEP website actually has a lot of examples from different higher education providers nationally. So there is actually quite a lot more information there too.
Great, thanks, Belle.
This last bit of our presentation is really an acknowledgement that some of you in the audience, actually there's a lot of people in the audience, some of you in the audience are going to be working in the education space, or maybe one of our peak bodies. But then there's actually going to be a lot of people who are practitioners or registered psychologists, or just working in the mental health space or the social emotional wellbeing space. So wanting to just kind of finish our yarn around or both, as someone's just commented, like myself, I'm both a practitioner in private practice as well as in a research space. So just having a bit of a think about how to apply some of these principles in your own personal journey and growth, okay, whether you're in research or education or in practice. So to start with, all of us, we all need to have a genuine curiosity and interest to learn about Australia's history of colonisation. And this includes understanding the timeline of social justice events like what we highlighted earlier. Really important to kind of get that contextual understanding of where Australia is at and where it's been. And then adding on that, learning about your local context. So know the country that you're on, know the language groups, know maybe some of the history, for example, the history of massacres in your area, or even, issues around, what missions were in your area, even understanding how COVID has impacted Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in your area. So really understanding the broader context of Australia as well as your local context. If you're unfamiliar with, with this, a very important discipline of psychology, which is Indigenous psychology, start to kind of have some curiosity around that. Maybe even put that as one of your professional development, your CPD with your registration body. Start to kind of, read some of the key documents around SEWB. So one of the really important documents is the Working Together book. Thank you, Pat. If you don't know this, you should know this. As you can see, I've got a million little tabs in there. So much valuable information there around, you know, working culturally appropriately, but also SEW, working in the SEWB space. Same with the strategic framework. So these are really good documents to be able to help us start to not just understand SEWB as a model, but how to start conceptualizing and formulating, you know, in our practice from that holistic, multidimensional perspective. And it doesn't have to be just with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients. You can start conceptualizing with this model with people from all walks of life and cultures. Consistent to the principles around education that Jo spoke about, really thinking about building relationships and partnerships in your community. So maybe that is, you know, identifying the local Aboriginal community controlled health organisation, Aboriginal medical services, knowing who the elders are in your community. There might even be cultural mentors or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues, you know, in your organisation. If you're, you know, solo in private practice, start to put the word out in some of your networks to see who's, you know, who's working in this space as well. The key here, I always say to people, is start building these connections now. Start building the relationships now. Don't wait till you have something pressing on your desk that you need to then get some sort of, you know, cultural advice around. Start the relationship building. Let's go to the next slide. Thanks, Jo. Oh, going back one. So making sure we have a collaborative community approach with both the individuals, families and communities that we work with. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have, you know, so much expertise in their own social and emotional well-being from within their community. They should be engaged as experts in their own right, and really honouring that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices, experiences, knowledge systems has profound epistemological value that that we need to bring into our practice. So when you're looking at best practices, we're engaging with people on the ground to kind of integrate their knowledges and expertise, but we're also looking more broadly around where I'm gaining information from. So when you go to your peer-reviewed journal search engines, you know, you're going to look there to see what's there in that kind of empirical data. You might find that there's quite huge gaps. You're going to have to look in other more innovative places. So having a look in the AIPEP website around decolonising psychology, SEWB models. You're going to be looking at some of the documents that I, you know, held up on the screen before. We're also another great website to look at. We have the Centre for Best Practice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Suicide Prevention. Huge amounts of best practice information there for you to draw on. This information might not show up in the empirical research articles, but the knowledge is there, the expertise is there, and it is of really good quality. Finally, to touch on, and this I guess has been a bit more implicit in what we've been talking about, but a decolonising practice requires us to look inwards. All of us. It requires us to have a stance and a willingness to and vulnerability to have that self-reflexive practice, knowing how we're positioned in relation to the people that we're working with, looking at what our biases are, and rather than seeing that as a shaming process, but as a growth opportunity to start to kind of shift and move in our practices. It also includes being willing to look at racism, whether it's overt or covert, you know, in our practices, but in the organisations that we're either involved in or associated with. So that's a really important part as an individual process, is to have that reflexive practice, working towards an anti-racism stance. Okay, so these are a few of the, I guess, kind of principles as individuals that we can take on. I guess I, again, want to reiterate the AIPEP website, that we're always uploading new information there. So there's the AIPEP website. We also, there's that Working Together book, and I can see in some of the chats, people were singing the praises of this book. Thank you, Pat, as our pioneer. This is also on the AIPEP website as well. There's, you know, really lovely video resources such as the Journey of Health and Wellbeing. If you haven't watched this, this is beautiful. This is one of my, you know, go-to favorite videos to watch, and it's easily found on YouTube. Here's an important list of resources. So we've got the AIPEP website, the Timber website, the Centre for Best Practice website, our fact sheets, the links there to the AIPEP frameworks, the AIPA paper, the Insight article, Gaia Dewey declaration. So lots of really, really important information there. We're also, our two social media platforms, if you want to follow us on Twitter. So we have our Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing, as well as the Centre for Best Practice in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Suicide Prevention. Both are fairly active with current resources and movements in our programs. So definitely follow those. Now, to finish off, and really the heart and intention behind bringing this video at the end is to, I guess, just kind of round off and land us in a really lovely way. And what I love about this very brief video, this 3-minute video, is that it really does show just the absolute beauty of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. It shows the strengths and resilience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but it also really shows why we're working towards decolonising psychology and Indigenous psychology. It's because it's about building this really beautiful future for our communities, and in particular our young people as well. So let's finish off here, and that'll kind of wrap up our presentations, and then we'll go into Q&A.
Great. And Rama, would you be able to share that video on your screen?
I can do that for you.
Thank you. Rama, I'm not getting sound on my end.
One second, I'll just speak sound.
Right.
Turning far away from the northern lights. Turn to look back across the ocean. Our struggle no longer in view. For as long as you feel loved, for as long as you feel ancient warmth now is all around me, melts and shifts the snow.
Rivers flowing across my country, it's taking me back home.
For as long as you feel love, for as long as you're feeling loved.
The song's first raised birds away.
fresh new day.
I sit in the night, the stars so bright, through the branches of the julga tree.
For as long as you feel love, for as long as you feel love.
Yeah. As long as you're feeling love, that's all that matters in the end of the day. I see so many people trying to fit in, but be yourself is the way. Never care what they say, stay on your grind, and everything will be okay. Shoot for the stars, forget all your troubles in the day. Keep your head full of hope and your heart full of love. Remember where you came from and who you are. Culture is everything, and culture is life. So when I'm rapping on the mic, I bring my culture to life. We all destined to rise, we weren't born to fall. So if you see a brother and sister down in the dumps, give a helping hand up and ask if they're okay. Cause no family should have to bury their loved ones on any given day.
Amazing. You guys can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thank you, Pat, Joanna, and Belle. That was really amazing. I mean, just judging by the comments that people have made here and the questions that we've got. Look, right from the start, Pat, I think it's really the work that has gone into this, the history that you've provided, and I think the way in which indigenous knowledge, indigenizing, and the work that you've done here as an example of maybe the global move towards decolonizing, but the sort of decentering, the sort of work of decentering, I guess the Eurocentric or the weird Western educated industrial rich democratic sorts of knowledges is really important. I think some of the sorts of lessons, I guess, that resonates with me also is the invitation, I guess, or the sort of challenge to us in Australia as a very plural place, to understand, I guess, some of the sorts of significance of Aboriginal knowledges locally, but also I think also globally, in terms of the ways of being that is being generated and that is resurgent, but what that does in terms of thinking about our very systems and our sorts of ways of being here. So there's a sort of it's a sort of an agenda and a call that goes and reaches way beyond psychology. I think the stuff that I think AIPEP and the sort of energy that's been generated around that at this particular moment in time and history, I think resonates maybe with the desire for other ways to be in relation and to work together and to think together as people, but also in relation to country, I think, and just the rich knowledges and the rich concepts, I think, that you guys have introduced to us, and how we appropriate or how we think differently about psychology in relation to that sort of cultural knowledge, I think is just amazing for us. So I'm just going to go to a couple of questions here. We've literally got 5 minutes. I don't know if you guys can see them, but one of the questions I think maybe that speaks to, I guess, what are some of the sorts of ways in which, because psychology is a language, it has particular sorts of roots. So I think Ahmed has asked a question here about how psychological jargon is being treated within AIPEP. And I think it comes from the US, this question, and most Indigenous languages don't have words like depression, anxiety, and so forth. So what are some of the sorts of decolonizing that I guess that happens there in terms of the language that's being introduced as well?
Okay, I'll have the first stab of answering that, then I'll pass it over to Belle. I think, look, I think we have to, part of the whole decolonising project is to critically, appraise what's gone before. So we as Indigenous scholars, that's our responsibility. We have to always, even if it sounds good, we still have to give it a good hard look and see whether it suits us or not. So again, like the Guy Dewey statement, which I'd suggest everyone to read as well, the reality is some of our people will need mainstream ways of treating their distress. Maybe they'll need cultural ways as well, but it's a combination of that. I think that the whole term mental health is restrictive. So we almost shy away from it, but that's the common and well-known term for, your mental health. But that is implicit. It's all in your head. It's not about your connection to your family or your social situation, your history, and so on. So I think we do have to be careful of language. I think we do need to start interrogating everything, and that's how people are diagnosed as well. So there's a lot of cultural difference and nuances, but I would do it cautiously, because at the end of the day, the well-being of our clients is important as well. But Belle actually, I'm more of a researcher. Belle actually is a practitioner, so I'd ask Belle to make comment on that one.
Yeah, you set it up well in that if we do look at the Guy Dewey Declaration, it is about kind of that integration of different knowledge systems. I think where we are is in a really important time where for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people broadly, there is this understanding that our Western diagnostic system, so our, the ICD-10 and the DSM, right, we can't immediately jump to these diagnostic criterias and putting those labels, on our mob when they're coming for help. So there is a move away from talking about people's experiences with words like depression and anxiety. However, in saying that, some people I work with, they appreciate these labels because it gives them something to work with. So I think there is, autonomy in the personal experience. So this is working collaboratively and with each individual's worldview on how to make sense of their experience, and then working with that cultural interface together collaboratively to figure out what is part of, cultural expressions of distress that needs cultural intervention, and what is something else. Now, that's not going to be in one session or one meeting. That is going to take that relationship building. That's going to take that time for you and the person narratively to kind of work that together, finding terms that make sense together. Maybe you're involving, other, cultural healers or elders to make sense together. I have had some clients who have been very thankful to label their experience psychosis, because it helped them make sense of what was happening for them, and that they weren't, didn't do something culturally wrong, or there wasn't something happening that needed some sort of cultural intervention around. So I think there's this, interplay between working at the person level and locally where we're at, to figure out what understandings of someone's experience makes sense. I think I'm just going to say in terms of my own process, I'm trained in clinical psychology, very much had that Western Eurocentric training. And I'm still going through my own process of decolonising my practice. And I think that's just really real and human, that just being an Aboriginal woman doesn't mean I necessarily have all the answers or can predict the future of where Indigenous psychology is going to go. But I do have my own kind of process that I'm working with myself. But I just want to put that there as well, just to kind of let everyone know that this is normal, that some of these big questions we have a sense, but we're also kind of individuals as well as collectively working towards more culturally appropriate ways of being, knowing and doing in a psychology space.
Thank you, Belle. Look, I'm really conscious of people's time, and I'm really sorry that we started a little bit late. We've just on 2:30, and I know people have busy lives and may have to get to other meetings. So I think Belle, Pat, and Joanna, you'd be happy to receive questions, or for us to send the questions to you as well. But can I just thank you deeply for doing this. I think it's a really invigorating conversation and a really important one for us to have. And you're showing, you're leading the way in terms of getting us to think within psychology, but this obviously has much wider resonance because indigenization and decolonization is a much broader call for, I think we said, humanizing practices, I think, for different ways of being human in relationship. And so this work here is an example of how that has taken shape in a specific discipline, but with wider resonance, I think, in terms of our society at least. So I really deeply want to thank you guys for doing this for us, and I hope that we can. Yeah, you want? Are you
oh, that's right. I'm putting my hand up, but in real life. Look, Chris, I'd be interested because I feel like, because we did have that late start. Maybe we should do a follow-up seminar in a couple of months' time, and then we'll just assume that everyone's seen the presentation, but we can carry on a conversation from there. So I happily dob myself, Belle, and
you've
Joanna
happily dobbed. Yes, you've dobbed in the three of them. So watch the space. We're gonna.
So you guys on the make sure you keep your eyes out then for.
So we will have another one. Yeah. Yes. Okay, we'll definitely do a part 2. So yep, we've committed to that. And I also just want to say that in a couple of weeks, maybe the 14th of April, we're going to have Professor Chelsea Wattago from University of Queensland, I think, but she's going to talk about rethinking the place and purpose and practice of critical race scholarship. So I think it will be a nice interchange with this pattern then for us to return to this conversation in a couple of weeks or a couple of months, maybe not a couple of weeks.
Yeah,
I just saw Belle and Joanna's expression then when I said weeks, but
send us the link for Chelsea's session too. We'll promote it, and some of us will certainly attend it.
Okay, I'll circulate. Yep, as soon as we got that one going, I'll circulate that. So thank you everyone for participating. It was really great that we had this amount of support for this.
Thanks,
thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks.
Okay, ta-da then. Bye.
Whoa, Puru.